It's August 2025 and I'm on the world's largest catamaran, heading from the Swedish port of Ystad to the Danish island Bornholm and its capital Rønne. Located in the Baltic Sea, almost equidistant from the southern coast of Sweden and the northern coasts of Germany and Poland, the island of Bornholm has been fought over for centuries. Originally owned by Denmark, when Denmark owned most of what is today southern Sweden, the island was pawned to Lübeck, then the capital of the Hanseatic League, in 1525 for 50 years in payment by Frederick I of Denmark for the League's help in his acquisition of the Danish throne. The island was invaded by the Swedes during the Torstenson War in 1645, but they returned the island following a peace settlement. However, just 13 years later, in 1685, the island, along with the rest of their lands on the southern Scandinavian peninsula, was ceded to Sweden as part of the Treaty of Roskilde. Swedish rule of the island was fleeting, as the Bornholm uprising took place on the 8th and 9th of December 1685, during which the population of the island rose up against their new Swedish overlords, primarily over taxation and conscription. This led to the assassination of the Swedish governor and the collapse of Swedish forces on the island, with the Bornholmer forces handing control of the island back to Denmark. Following local government changes in 2007, the island has been part of the capital region of Denmark, making it part of the same county as Copenhagen, even if it's closer to 3 other countries than the Danish capital. The capital and largest settlement on Bornholm is Rønne, located at the westernmost point of the island. It's likely that settlement in Rønne first took place around 1000, with a small fishing community growing up around the natural harbour. In 1275, a small chapel dedicated to St Nicholas was built, which later developed into the large church that is today one of the defining features of the skyline of the town as you arrive into the harbour. In the early 14th century, the community was granted the status of a market town, with the founding of Rønne given as 1327. Even with its gaining of town status, Rønne and Bornholm more generally was being eyed covetously by its neighbours, both within the Danish Empire and the wider region. The King of Denmark, the Archbishop of Lund, and several North German princes were all competing for control of the town. The Germans were particularly interested in Bornholm as a strategic position in the Baltic Sea. However, the group that took the strongest position was a trading and military alliance of the Hanseatic League and its capital, Lübeck. Starting in the 15th century, Rønne was repeatedly plundered and burnt by the men of Lübeck, proving that the Hanseatic League was equal parts merchants and militia. The attacks from the Lübeckers only really ceased when the island was pawned to them in 1525 to pay off the King of Denmark's substantial debts. In a pattern that was to be repeated, albeit much more rapidly, of the Swedish a century later, the Hansa demanded ever higher taxes from the local population, and this eventually led to the citizens rising up and taking revenge, eventually chasing the Lübeckers off the island whilst allowing other German communities to remain. In 1576, control of Rønne was returned to the Danish crown. Over the following centuries, the town suffered from both a decline in the fishing industry and 2 bouts of plague in 1619 and 1655, and it took decades for its economy to recover, not helped by the, albeit temporary, change to Swedish rule for a few months in 1658. In 1834, the town hall was built in Stortorv, the town's main square, and this became the centre of administration for both Rønne and Bornholm for many years. Early on the morning of the 9th of April 1940, Denmark was invaded by the Nazis, and with that, control of the island passed into German hands. The island survived the war with very little impact, other than the crash landing of an experimental V-1 bomb on the island in 1942. The wreckage was secretly photographed and documented by the Danish naval officer in charge on Bornholm, Lieutenant Commander Hasager Christensen, and the details rapidly made their way into the hands of British intelligence, giving them the first indication that Germany was planning on building flying bombs and rockets. On the 7th and 8th of May 1945, the very last days of the war, the Soviet Air Force bombed the island, targeting Rønne and the eastern port town of Nexø, reportedly because the German occupying forces refused to surrender after the rest of Denmark had been liberated on the 4th. The bombing raids destroyed or damaged most of the houses in Rønne and killed at least 10 civilians. On May the 9th, 1945, the Soviets occupied Bornholm, and it wasn't until nearly a year later, on the 5th of April 1946, when an agreement was reached with the Danish authorities and the island finally passed back under Danish control. The rebuilding of Rønne took several years, with much of it being rebuilt in its traditional architecture of quaint streets and half-timbered houses. Denmark, including Greenland and the Faroes, raised around 8 million Danish kroner. That's around 200 million kroner, or £23 million, or 27 million euros in today's value, to help with rebuilding. In addition, Sweden sent over 300 timbered houses to help with the reconstruction. The town's History and Culture Museum, located in the old hospital of the town, opened in 1894, a year after the founding of the Museum Association. The building was expanded in the early 1920s to house growing collections, which included artefacts showing Neolithic settlement on the island through until the modern day. The collection includes a large number of hoard finds of coins and gold discovered across the island. As well as an exhibition on clocks and clockmaking. Rønne became famous for its long case or grandfather clocks, which were manufactured on the island from the middle of the 18th century until around 1900. Interest in clockmaking on the island started when a Dutch ship sailing from England ran aground off Rønne in 1744, carrying 5 grandfather clocks which were damaged in the accident. The sailors called on a local woodturner, Paul Otterson Arbo, to repair the clocks, which he was successfully able to do, and from the experience he gained in those repairs, he went on to start manufacturing clocks himself. Several workshops sprung up on Bornholm producing the clocks, which became popular as they were cheaper than models produced elsewhere. At the height of production, there were around 30 different clockmakers in Rønne, producing 2,000 clocks a year. The business died out when industrialisation of clock manufacture elsewhere, notably Birmingham in the UK, made the handcrafted products too expensive. Next to the clock gallery are recreations of what homes would have looked like on the island in previous years. There's also the recreation of a Rønne school classroom. And the inside of a general store from early in the 20th century. More recent exhibits deal with the island's position during the Cold War period. One of the conditions on handing back Bornholm was that no foreign troops could ever be stationed on the island, as it would be considered a declaration of war against the USSR. The policy remained in force even when Denmark became a founding member of NATO. On the day of Stalin's death, a Polish pilot defected from the Eastern Bloc and landed his MiG-15 fighter on the island, giving Western intelligence agencies access to the then newest Soviet jet fighter. One of the more moving exhibits is an example of a small inflatable boat used by refugees fleeing across the Baltic to the island from the DDR during the years of communist rule in East Germany. At its narrowest point, it's less than 60 miles from the north coast of Rügen to the southern coast of Bornholm, and with that, an escape into the west. In the grounds, the museum is an example of one of the bomb shelters built on the island during the Second World War, which you can descend down into to experience how cramped and how few facilities there would have been for people sheltering down here. Along with the museum and the former hospital, the Bornholm Museum also operates a number of other sites across the island, with the former terracotta factory of Lauritz Adolf Hjorth being another site in the town. The Hjorths Fabrik was founded in 1859, originally in Lauritz's parents' house, but 3 years later he moved into a property on Costal. The following decade he purchased the neighbouring property to expand into. Whilst located in his parents' house, Lauritz had initially produced water coolers, flower pot covers and matchstick holders, but with the move into the new factory, he refocused on decorative objects in an antique style, with statuettes, vases and figurines being produced in terracotta. Following the factory's expansion, the company was able to export their terracotta objects globally, with their products being found in the fashionable department stores of Paris, Berlin, London, New York, St. Petersburg and Vienna, as well as making their way to Australia and the Danish West Indies. The factory participated in many world exhibitions, often winning prizes. Lauritz died in 1912, at which point the factory was taken over by his 2 sons, Peter and Hans. Peter became the sole proprietor in 1931, and the factory then passed to his son, Eric. In 1982, Eric's 2 daughters, Ulla and Marie, took over running of the factory for its final 11 years. The factory was closed by the sisters in 1993 and 2 years later reopened as a working museum under the Bornholm Museum, which to this day continues to do small batch production of decorative items. The museum is laid out in the order that the work progresses, from initial stone crushing through the various stages of shaping, moulding and decoration to final firing of the product. Along the way you can visit the throwing room, where a series of potter's wheels allow multiple people to work on turning the raw clay into plates, figurines or other objects for the museum is producing on that day. At the height of their success, one of the factory's main products were apothecary jars. They started manufacturing in 1927 when a pharmacy in Esbjerg on the west coast of mainland Denmark ordered some lidded jars. The requirement from the pharmacy was the jars must be acid resistant and suitable for storing pharmaceutical ingredients. Within a year, a pharmacist in Rønne had also purchased some of the jars. The jars spread and were in use across Denmark in pharmacies until the 1960s. After touring the production area of the factory, you can then visit the offices, where 4 generations of the family ran the business from. This part of the site also houses more on the history of the company and the family. Back in the other main building of the site is a small exhibition showing part of the family's collection of decorative pottery and earthenware displayed in chronological order from ancient Greek through to the relatively modern day. There's also a gallery housing some of their more experimental pieces in their collection. A few of which do look like they came straight from the set of the first Beetlejuice movie. And down in the basement is another small chronological collection of general earthenware, starting from around 6,000 years ago through until the early 21st century. St Nicholas Church is the largest church in the town, and the current building is located on the site of the first modest church building, which was erected around 1275. At the time of construction, the church was only a summer chapel, with the main church being Knud's Church, some 3 kilometres inland. The growth of Rønne required the expansion of the church, and around 1350 a substantial extension was built on the western end of the church, doubling its length. Parts of this extension still exist to today in the current north wall of the church. The iconic tower was added in 1550 and rebuilt in 1699. In 1797, the north arm was built and the altar was moved to the south wall of the church. Major reconstruction took place between 1915 and 18 with the addition of the south transept and the widening of the whole building. Restoration works were carried out again between 1982 and 83. The tower of the church is now a defining part of the skyline of the town as you approach it from the sea, the other part of that skyline being the Rønne Fyr or Rønne Lighthouse. Originally built in 1880, it replaced a simple light which had previously stood on the site. The structure is a tapered, white-painted octagonal tower in cast iron with a lantern and gallery on top. The total height is 18 metres, which gave it a visibility of around 17.5 kilometres from sea level. The lighthouse was taken out of use in 1987, but continues to be maintained as a landmark. I'm taking advantage of the excellent public transport on the island, even on a Sunday, to explore more of the sunniest island in Denmark, starting by heading up the north coast to the castle at Hammershus. Standing on a cliff 74 metres above sea level and surrounded by a 750-metre long curtain wall, the fortifications at Hammershus represent the largest castle ruins in northern Europe and also one of Bornholm's top visitor attractions. But as it's open 24 hours a day and it's free to visit at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning, it's also one of its most deserted. Works on the castle are believed to have started around the 13th century, possibly by an agreement between the King of Denmark, Valdemar the Victorious, and the Archbishop of Lund, which for time would have been part of the Danish kingdom. In 1265, the castle was conquered by Valdemar's grandson Erik V Klipping, but returned to the Archbishop 11 years later. This may not have been the greatest of ideas, as the castle became an important site in the power struggles between the king and church in the decades that followed. In 1319, under the instruction of Erik VI Menved, the castle was captured back by the king, bringing to an end a period when outlaws could seek shelter in the castle to evade the monarchy. Just 2 years later, having come to the throne after the death of his brother, Christopher II handed the castle back to the archbishop. Proving that those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it, Christopher's son, Valdemar III, took control of the castle in 1325 after a 16-month siege, but soon after, and you won't believe this, handed it back to the archbishops. The archbishops managed to keep it under their control for almost 200 years until 1522, when in a fast-moving series of events, Christian II of Denmark-Norway claimed the castle and placed the Bishop of Odense into custody in the castle, only for a few months later for the castle to fall into the hands of Lübeckers as they started to conquer the island. The Lübeckers took full control of the island in 1526 as it was pawned to them to pay the debts that Frederick I incurred in his successful attempt to seize the throne from his nephew. The Lübeckers renovated the castle, including increasing the height of the main Mantell Tower, clearly identifiable by the change from grey stone to red brick, and used it as a base for the 50 years they held the island before it was returned to the Danish king. After return to Danish hands, the castle was allowed to fall into disrepair as it was considered to be out of date as a fortification, in part due to the improvements in firearms. Instead, it was converted into a state prison and used to house significant state prisoners, including Corfitz Ulfeldt and his wife Leonora Christiana, the daughter of King Christian IV. Corfitz had been accused of embezzlement and plotting to murder Christian IV's successor, Frederick III, and went on the run to Sweden, where he worked to incite the Swedish government against Denmark. This has earned him a reputation as one of Denmark's greatest traitors. Once a traitor, always a traitor. He was then accused of high treason by the Swedish authorities, but he escaped whilst on house arrest and fled to Denmark with his wife, where they were promptly imprisoned in Hammershus for 17 months, before being released after signing a declaration of submission renouncing their privileges and possessions. The use of the fortress as a prison eventually ended in 1743, from which point the site became a very useful pre-cut quarry for new buildings, with several buildings in Rønne being constructed from the stones of the Hammershus. In 1822, the ruins of the castle as they stood at that point were listed, which prevented any more of the site being lost and slowly turning it into a tourist attraction that it is today. The site, in its dramatic location high on the cliffs above the sea on the north coast of Bornholm, is open to the public 24 hours a day, but with no lighting and very uneven ground, it's advisable to only visit during daylight hours. Located a short distance back from the castle ruins and close to both the car park and the bus stop is a visitor centre and cafe, which is open during the main part of the day, every day of the week during the summer, and at weekends outside of summer. The centre offers an accessible viewing platform from where you can get excellent views of the full scale of the castle if you don't fancy the hike up to the site itself, and downstairs inside the centre is an exhibition on the history of Hammershus. 2.5 kilometres north of Hammershus is the village of Sandvig, the northernmost settlement on the island, and from here the starting point of an easy 4 kilometre circular walk out and around the headland to the northernmost point on the island. After heading through the dunes and the heath, you first reach the coast by Salomons Kapel. The chapel is a medieval ruin that was built at the beginning of the 14th century at the instigation of the Archbishop of Lund. Large parts of the island had been granted to the Archbishop of Lund in 1149 by then Danish King Svend Graffe. It's thought that the construction of the chapel is linked to the herring markets that arose on the east and north coasts of Bornholm in the 13th to 15th centuries. The church would have served as a place of worship for traders and especially fishermen who caught large quantities of herring in this part of the Baltic Sea, and it had established the settlement and harbour at Sandvik around the same time. Close to the chapel was a spring that was considered holy and would have been a site of small-scale pilgrimage to take the waters. Fishing declined in the late 15th century and the site was abandoned. The final blow to the chapel would have been the Reformation of 1536, which meant both the chapel and the spring lost their importance and the structure slowly fell into disrepair. Today, the ruins are protected as a historical monument. From Salomons Kapel, the walking trail turns north and heads along the coast all the way to Hammerodde Fyr, or Hammerodde Lighthouse, located at the very northern tip of Bornholm. The lighthouse was built in 1885 to complement the nearby Hammerodde Lighthouse, which, due to its altitude of 91 metres, cannot always be seen from the sea in foggy conditions. The square tower is just 12 metres high and from the start was equipped with a rotating lens. From Sandvik, it's 16 kilometres southeast down the coast of Bornholm to the port town of Gudhjem. The town is laid out down the steep roads that lead down from the main road at the top of the hill to the port at the bottom. Gudhjem has been a vital link to the smaller outlying archipelago of Holmene and its two inhabited islands of Kristiansø and Fredriksø since 1684, when a ferry connection was first established. Due to its position at almost exactly 15 degrees east, or 1/24th of the planet from Greenwich, the town has been the base of the Danish time zone since 1893. The town was founded in the 13th century, and its fishermen are reported to have been the first on the island to start smoking herring, with smoked herring being exported to Copenhagen in the 1860s. 12 kilometres to the south of Gudhjem and almost at the centre point of the island is the Ekkodalen, Denmark's longest rift valley that stretches the full 12 kilometres back to the northeast coast. Originally called Ekkodalen or Cow Valley, probably because of a royal edict of 1658 that gave the local peasants the right to free grazing of cattle in the valley was first referred to as Ekkodalen on a map in 1746. The shape and angle of the cliffs that rise up vertically from the valley floor create the perfect conditions for creating remarkable echoes. At times in the past, this was tested by firing cannon, whose shots were reported to echo tenfold after bouncing off the rocks. Much to the dismay of the local peasants who lost their free grazing rights, in 1809 the state forester, Hans Rønne, built a stone wall all the way around the Elmenning forest, creating Denmark's third largest forest that included much of the valley. Today, you can walk along the edge of the valley floor before taking a boardwalk out over the small stream that runs along the valley floor to reach the cliffs on the opposite side. A set of stairs allows you to ascend quickly to the top of the cliff some 20 metres above the valley floor, and from there access trails that runs further up into the higher cliffs above the valley, eventually leading to the highest point of the island, Røde, which is 162 metres above sea level. Along the way you pass through the ruins of the Gamelborg, the first fortification built on the island by the island's king during the Viking Age. The large fortress occupies one of the highest points on the island. It's 264 metres long north to south and 110 metres wide east to west, but only has gates at the north and southwest of the walls. The site was abandoned sometime around 1150. From Ekkodalen I retraced my steps back to Gudhjem, and from there completed my exploration of the island by heading to the eastern port town of Nexø. With a population of just under 4,000, Nexø is the second largest town, as well as being the largest fishing port on the island. Up until its suspension during COVID, the port was also a terminal for ferries to Poland. The city was founded in the 14th century, with the oldest privileges said to have originated from Lund's Archbishop of Peder in 1346. Nexø is mentioned as a market town in 1451 and had its privileges confirmed in 1555. Due to its importance, the city has suffered over the centuries as a target, being burnt to the ground by the Lübeckers in 1510 and then bombarded and plundered by the Swedish in 1645. By 1658, it was reported the population of Nexø had fallen to only 100, not helped by the town being hit by the plague 4 years earlier that had killed 413. As with Rønne, Nexø was targeted by the Soviets on the 7th and 8th of May 1945, with air raids destroying 750 of the 900 houses in the town. Consequently, most of the centre of the town is characterised by 1940s and 50s construction, though in places a few old half-timbered houses remain. The first mention of Ystad is in 1244, when King Erik and his brother Abel visited the city, though it's likely that a fishing village had been founded in the port in the 50 years or so beforehand, after the Danish conquest of the southern Baltic coast under Absalon, Bishop of Roskilde and Archbishop of Lund, brought peace to this part of Scandinavia. With the emergence of the German Hanseatic League around the same time, the herring trade became an important economy across this part of the Baltic and likely led to the creation of the port. The mid-13th century also saw the establishment of both St Mary's Church and the Franciscan or Grey Friars Monastery in the town. A charter of 1599 gave the town the right to export oxen. In 1658, Ystad, along the rest of Skåne County, Scania in English, as in the truck and bus manufacturer originally from the region, was transferred from Denmark to Sweden as part of the Treaty of Roskilde. By the end of the 19th century, the town had a railway connection and was established as a garrison town. After World War II, the port was developed to start ferry services to Bornholm in Denmark and Świnoujście in Poland. The church of St Mary's, or Sankta Maria Kirke, was first consecrated in the 13th century as a Romanesque basilica, but a storm on the 20th of April 1648 caused the tower to collapse, taking the western part of the church with it. Just 2 years later, a new transept had been completed, but in the Renaissance style rather than the original Romanesque style. Whilst the transept was constructed quickly, the tower wouldn't be completed until the end of the century. In the 1830s, extensive changes are made to the building, with larger windows installed and exterior buttresses added. In 1886, further changes are made to the interior of the church, with a new concrete floor laid, the old pews were removed, along with much of the church's decoration. Between 1923 and 1925, extensive renovations unpicked much of the work that had been carried out less than 40 years earlier, with the tombstones and epitaphs that had been removed from the church floor returned to where they had previously been. There are now about 40 tombstones on the church floor, mostly dating to the 17th and 18th century. The pulpit is regarded to be one of the finest pieces of Baroque work in Skåne. It was added between 1626 and 1631 and is made from limestone with a wooden canopy. Whilst the rear of the church sits on the Stortorget, the area in front of the church is its own separate square in the Kyrkoplan. The centre of town includes a number of small passageways and alleyways, many of them converging on the Klostret I Ystad, or the Grey Friars Monastery. The Franciscan monastery was founded in 1267 and is one of the oldest and best preserved monastic sites in Sweden. The monastery was set up within 50 years of the order being founded by Francis of Assisi. Founding of the Ystad monastery was funded by a knight named Holger and his wife Katrina, who donated a considerable sum of money and the plot of land on which the buildings were constructed. Whilst construction started in the 13th century, it wouldn't be until the 16th century that the complex would be completed, with the church and the three wings of the courtyard being the first elements to be constructed. Building work only stopped because the Grey Friars were driven away from the monastery as part of the Reformation in 1532. The eastern wing of the monastery was preserved for use as a hospital, but the northern and western wings were demolished. The remaining building served as a hospital until 1777, when a crown distillery was established on the site. The building had fallen into disrepair when it was finally purchased by the town in 1876, who then set about a lengthy restoration and renovation of the site that wasn't completed until 1912, at which point it reopened as the City History Museum. Other notable attractions in the town include the new town hall in the Österportstorg, which has been the home of the town hall since October 1921. The railway station was originally opened in 1865, though the Grand Station building is now restaurants and a B&B with a much simpler station having been created on the town side of the tracks next to the bus station. Beyond the station is the harbour, which is looked over by the Ystad Fyr. Bornholm Airport, 5 kilometres southeast of Rønne, has year-round flights to Copenhagen, with that taking around 40 minutes to make the quick hop. Bornholm's Linje run frequent high-speed catamaran services from Rønne to Ystad in Sweden, taking less than 90 minutes. From Ystad you can connect to local trains to Malmö and then Öresundståg trains to Copenhagen Airport, taking around 3 to 3.5 hours for the full journey. There are also daily ferries to Kirke in Denmark, taking 5.5 hours, and between 1 and 6 ferries a week to Sassnitz in Germany, taking 3.5 hours. Copenhagen Airport is the largest of the main airports in Scandinavia, a hub for SAS and Norwegian, with connections across North America, Europe, North Africa, the Middle East and Far East.